In this lecture, we are going to use a static property for setting the HTTP methods of our custom endpoints. Check out the resource section of this lecture for a link to a class called WP REST Server. This is a class defined by WordPress. Looking through the class, there are hundreds of lines of code. It's massive. Luckily, the code we care about can be found at the top of the class. This class has 4 properties called readable, creatable, editable, and deletable. The values for these properties contain HTTP methods. WordPress defines these methods for our convenience. In an application, methods should be standardized. For example, if we're retrieving data, the server should always use the GET method for listening for requests. If we have inconsistent usage of methods, it can be confusing for developers. By sticking to a standard, it'll be easier to predict what kind of requests can be made. WordPress recommends the following methods. If we're trying to read data, the method should be GET. Endpoints for creating data can use the POST method. We can use the POST, PUT, or PATCH methods for editing data. Lastly, the delete method is reserved for deleting data. These properties are created with the const keyword. We haven't had the opportunity to discuss this keyword, but it's very straightforward. The const keyword creates a constant within a class. It's different from defining a regular constant. Similar to defining constant variables, constant properties cannot be modified after their definition. Next, the const keyword will allow the property to be accessible to the public. For this reason, the public keyword does not need to be added. Lastly, constants can be treated like static properties. We do not need to create an instance to use these properties. The question becomes, why would we want to use these properties? Truthfully, we can set the methods of our routes by hard-coding them. However, we should adhere to WordPress standards. If WordPress believes that retrieving data should be performed with the GET method, our routes should reflect that standard. What if WordPress decides to use a different method? Our code base must be updated to reflect those changes. We would need to update the routes one by one. Rather than hard-coding the values, we can use these properties. If they change, our code will automatically reflect the current standard. At the end of the day, it's up to you. For this course, let's use these constants to our advantage. In your editor, open the init.php file. Inside the first route, update the methods key to the WP REST Server creatable property. We are using the creatable property because we're creating a user. The value for this property is POST. We do not need to make further changes to this route. Let's try moving on to the next route. The second route's methods property should be set to WP REST Server editable. The editable property supports multiple methods. We can use POST, PUT, or PATCH. Once again, we do not need to update our code base further. After making those changes, let's try testing our endpoints with Postman. Open the Postman application. First, let's try testing the registration endpoint. Before doing so, I'm going to update the body of the request to contain empty values. Next, I'll initiate the request. In the response body, the endpoint has received the request. We can verify the response by checking the status property. Awesome! Let's try doing the same for the login endpoint. Inside the body of the request, leave the properties with empty values. Lastly, initiate the request. Same result as before. We are given an object with the status property. By using WordPress's methods, we are following WordPress's standards. This step is not required. However, life's easier when there are standards across the board. With that said, we have completed the blocks. It took almost 3 hours, but it was well worth it. We've learned a lot about block development and WordPress. Our journey isn't over yet. We've got some work to do. Feel free to take a break. Once you're refreshed, I'll see you in the next section.